it is a true pleasure to introduce our first guest, Kevin E. Baird. Kevin chairs the Center for College and Career Readiness, is the Chief Academic Officer at Achieve 3000, and serves on the Board of NABU, partnering with the UN to improve global literacy. Kevin, it's wonderful having you with us today once more. From where are you zooming in today?
Great to see you, Sven. Well, last time I was here, I was at my home in the Andes in Colombia, but I'm actually in the US today. So I'm in Florida. Very similar ecosystems, though, a lot of rain.
Very, very good. So in the next 25 minutes, I want to discuss with Kevin the topic of school assessment. Our conversation will be the warm-up, as we have seen, for the following roundtable, how to assess learning in a changing world. And I'm sure a lot of things we will discussing the roundtable then can take up and discuss and counter argue or support us. So Kevin, when I think about assessment in schools, two questions come up to my mind immediately. First, today Google knows everything, right? This is one of the phrases we always hear. In this context, what's actually the overarching goal of schools going forward? And secondly, based on that goal, how do we measure success?
Sure. So, first of all, I don't know that the goal of schooling has significantly changed in terms of our societies, right? Schools should help to ensure that we are creating adults who are going to be successful, who are going to contribute to our economy, who are going to move our societies forward. I think the challenge is that our societies have changed, our economies have changed. And so I'm reminded here in the US, Carnegie and Rockefeller were really critical in putting together the modern American curricula nearly 150 years ago. And Rockefeller said, I don't want thinkers, I want workers. And I think actually many of our schools and our communities would still say, well, we want people who are able to work inside of the economy. It's just that has really changed. And so the last part of that answer is that if I can look up everything, it's not about a fact anymore. Obviously, I still have factories, but those factories have really changed. And a lot of my work is also creative work, or knowledge workers, right? So I need to be able to think, to create. But that said, also, if I say I need to be able to think, I need to be able to create, I need to be able to collaborate, I need to be able to do this, what does that really mean? Well, there are very explicit skills that are a part of those activities. We don't necessarily see those skills in a curriculum scope and sequence. We probably need to, right? For instance, I need to be able to identify what problem is going on in the world. I don't have Rockefeller telling me what the problem is, right? Or Ford telling me I'm going to make a car. I need to actually look around and see what is the problem. I need to be able to discern what are the elements of the problem. Elon Musk has a great paper where he talks about he was told that he could never do Tesla because he just couldn't get over the battery issue. And so he stepped back and he said, okay, we're going to break down that problem to its really minute points and figure out the most expensive part of that. And then from there, really start the problem solving. So I guess my short answer is we're still looking to create better societies. We still want to have folks who can power our economies, but that's really changed. And today it's changed, especially because I don't even know what the problem is. I have to be able to step outside and figure that out myself. Did I get at what you were thinking?
Yeah, I mean, and probably if we think, I mean, the biggest change in the workplace is probably still to happen, right? I mean, obviously there have been a lot of changes in the last 100 years, the second, the third, the fourth industrial revolution. But I mean, just think about technology, AI. I mean, I think we talked about this yesterday and we can argue about the percentages, but I think somebody said yesterday in the next, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years, probably 70% of today's jobs will be taken over by technology or machines or robots or whatever it will be, right?
Right.
So that's a profound change. And then what's the implication for education and how we teach our students?
You know, I think one of the significant implications as an organization, if we think about the organization of schools, is that a long time ago in a land far, far away, actually had a lot more interaction between businesses and schools. I mean, for instance, I just noted here in the US, whether it was Carnegie or Rockefeller or Ford or any of these folks who are literally helping to drive what was being thought about inside of schools. Today we have this really interesting separation. And on a state-by-state basis, a school-by-school basis, I don't necessarily have that same kind of interaction. I don't have the freedom or the authority to really think about what's my school, my organization, my classroom looking like compared to my local economy. And I'll give you an example of that. I was recently in the Inland Empire of California here in the US. And I was talking to a school district, and they happened to know that the vast majority of their students literally stay within 100-mile radius of where they're growing up. And so they really need to think about not just what are the jobs today, but what are the jobs tomorrow inside of that 100-mile radius. And they need to have the freedom to teach students to be able to do those jobs. So I think there's a localism that becomes very important. But today, in many scenarios, we've kind of nationalized the conversation. We've taken away that kind of autonomy, right? And the last thing I would say is that if I want a student to be able to really think about a problem, to solve a problem, to be able to analyze in a different way, I as a teacher need to have the freedom to do that too. And I'm struck by the no's that we just saw in that poll. I would ask other questions like, do you as a teacher have the authority, the independence to actually bring problems that are authentic to you or authentic to these kids into the classroom, to think through them? Are you required to have a right or a wrong? Are you being evaluated, yes or no, right? Yeah. If I can't think as a teacher, if I don't have that kind of independence, authority, autonomy, I'm never going to get there with my kids. That's my view.
Yeah. So talking about kids, my kids are 11 and 13, so they're still young. They've just finished grades 5 and 7. And when I look at their grading, we're getting the grades these days, right, at school, I get the impression that memorizing content and core subjects plays still a significant role, while cross-curricular, what we would call the soft skills or the 21st century skills like communication, collaboration, critical thinking, you talked about it, or even emotional intelligence, intuition, empathy, right, play no role at all, or just a small role. Yeah. Do we measure the correct things here, or do we need to change the assessment criteria to adjust to what's out there in the future?
We're all being tortured by a man named William Farish, who was a tutor at Cambridge a long time ago and literally created the modern grading program. By the way, not as a way to increase what anyone learned or knew or even remembered, but simply as a way to move more kids through his, more students through his tutoring program and make more money. That's true, by the way, that little history lesson is true. So is there any relationship between the things that we are assessing or grading or, quote, holding kids accountable to and what we actually want as outcomes? I don't think so. And I think if you're a self-reflective teacher, if you're a self-reflective leader or policymaker, what truly are we doing besides following someone else's very silly rule? Because that really is what we're doing. We're following someone's very silly rule. So all of the elements that you just suggested, Sven, I might look at, I may well look at, or I may well look at differently. And there are ways to assess all of those things. And by assessment, I mean to get information back to the student or to the teacher about those elements. Are we doing that? Generally, we aren't. We aren't because we are ourselves not responsible or accountable for that. And I think as a really pragmatic strategy, because I don't know that we're going to change the national structure of education, although I would love to, and we're fighting at that, right? Inside of this very strange structure that really has very little to do with what we want kids to be able to think about or to perform to. If I create rationality inside of that, I think the rationality inside of it will eventually eat the irrationality on the outside of that. So, I wouldn't be disheartened. Do I think that we should change the entire spectrum? We should. And by the way, here in the US, San Diego schools, they are a very large school district. They're changing their grading practices. I was just with the superintendent in Las Vegas. We all know Las Vegas because of the gambling. It's the 5th largest school district in the US. They're changing their entire grading scenario. So that can happen. But even if it can't, or if we don't feel empowered to do it, we can do it inside to think about how we're thinking about what we want our kids to be able to do. I literally clicked off of a conversation. That's why I was a little bit late getting on with you, where we were looking at feedback based on technology that looks at social emotional literacies. It's called Strong Minds. Really interesting stuff. You're not grading the kid, by the way. You're just giving the student feedback and the teacher feedback about how the student sees a variety of social emotional skills.
So we are grading basically, the wrong variables, right?
Yeah,
And also, I'm always struck with the fact, right? We grade at the end of the term, right? And then, for example, if I get a 70% at the end of the term of a math exam, then basically the teacher's telling me I have a 30% gap, knowledge gap, because I got only the 70%. But then nothing else happens, right? Because then we move on to the new content because the new term starts. So shouldn't we come to a completely different way of evaluation, getting rid of final exams, continuous evaluation, that are really helping me as a student to identify what are my learning gaps at every moment, and then allowing me to work on those to close them before moving to the next.
It's just torture, Sven. It's just, I mean, literally, it is just torture. Show me a high-performing organization that gives you one score at any one moment in time and says, okay, we're done. You failed there. And by the way, if you're a high performer and you don't get 100%, but you get a 90%, you might still feel like a failure. You actually destroy learning there. The work of John Hattie says that the single most important element for a student in terms of their learning is their self-efficacy or their self-confidence. You are literally just hammering them down. I have a phrase, which is, if you don't have quiz recovery, you're going to need credit recovery at the end, right? That continuous learning. But I think part of the issue is, what are you trying to assess or give feedback to? So really good curriculum can be thematic, right? It can be thematic. So I'm thinking over time. So I don't end at this unit or that unit or that unit and say, oh, I'm sorry, you didn't get all those concepts. You're not going to be able to go back. But thinking about it as a narrative from the beginning of the school year to the end of the school year. And that actually allows me to come back to those concepts as a student, as a learner, to revisit them and to also refine them over time. One last note there, if you're interested in things like social emotional literacy, or you're interested in engagement, my colleague, Dr. Paul Zak, Z-A-K, you can look him up, and we are the first researchers in the world to measure, using technology, neurobiologic signal to actually measure in real time student engagement. So we measure what's going on in the head through neurobiology. It looks like a little Apple Watch. What we found is that teachers who think about their class time as a narrative, like a little story that begins here and ends there, and the curricula that think about the entire school year as a story for that student, see radically different, deeper levels of engagement and deeper levels of success, because our brains are literally wired to learn and to remember through narrative, through stories, not these little bits. So, I hope that what I'm presenting there is a solution to think through how we would get to that, because you're right. It tells you nothing. Where in your life did anyone ever give you one piece of feedback, and that one piece of feedback led to some kind of incredible change? It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, that's true. And thinking that narrative really, I think it makes a lot of sense, because it puts everything in context, right? And the moment you help the kids to understand why they learn what they learn, everything becomes so much easier, right? Because you're not learning some abstract concepts, but really going on a path and build something you're working towards. So that's really.
And if you think about, I know you add we were kind of thinking about the question of elementary, middle, and high, right? And what might look different there. So I want you to think about, in elementary school, we work a lot toward fluency of very specific foundational skills.
Right.
So narrative doesn't mean that you can't do that. I like to think about multiplication, mathematics. Really good math instruction is a narrative. From how I put things together, that's addition, or I take one away, then it's subtraction, right? Or I'm thinking about them in sets, and how those sets build, and that's multiplication. So it isn't as if that idea of narrative gets rid of things that are factual, or even that I become fluent. As a matter of fact, if you think about really great stories like Goodnight Moon, and I keep reading them over and over. I read Goodnight Moon to my kids, gosh knows how many times, but they became really good at it. Then they could even predict what was going to happen. So don't think that narrative means I can't master facts or become fluent at something. I can.
Great. Let's look a little bit beyond schools, right?
Okay.
So because we're really struggling apparently in measuring what we're supposed to measure in schools, many large companies use all these models of 360 feedback, evaluation models to assess employee performance.
Mm-hmm.
Could concepts like peer-to-peer evaluation, self-evaluation help us to define a more learning-oriented, constructive feedback-oriented assessment model in school?
Sure. So the short answer is yes. A couple of examples or thoughts. So for instance, if any of the folks who are in our audience are thinking about they've led something, right? And they had to give feedback, or maybe they're a parent and they're giving feedback to their child. You learn inside of that interaction themselves. In Oklahoma City public schools, they have students whom they call newcomers. They're immigrants to the US. Many of them don't speak English, and they're actually writing their biography. The kids who actually edit those, the people who provide feedback to them on what they've written, are the students in the AP classes or in the more advanced classes. And so what you have now is you have a dynamic where our learners together at different levels are learning together, and they're advancing together. I think in the same way, if I think about, if I want to assess someone and their ability to collaborate, how do I do that? Well, if I'm a collaborator with them, I got to have a structure for how I provide feedback, right? How could that have happened better? A last thought there, there are really interesting, good tools. And by the way, there's probably been even more money to develop those tools that are used in corporate America. Like, for instance, I am a super fan of Gallup Strengths Finder. And I was recently in a meeting where folks were looking at how you apply Gallup Strengths Finder inside of a school setting. It's called a genius factor. So Strengths Finder was created by a guy named Clifton, and he wanted to see the world in strengths. He wanted to change the world that way instead of seeing the world as gaps. Those kinds of tools can literally change a conversation in a classroom, can change a culture of a school, help the student to self-reflect, and help my students to become better collaborators. So those are all examples of how I might gain feedback and give feedback, right, to those really key outcomes that I want. I don't have a grading scale for, are you going to be a good person, or can you get along? And one last thing, sorry, I'm rambling. If you ask the employers, if you ask the business leaders, they would say 90% of success in the working world is emotional intelligence. Right? So I need to give some feedback there. I don't have am I going to give you an A in emotional intelligence? What does that mean? Instead, I might say, hey, Sven, you are super awesome at creating agendas and telling me exactly what I need to do. And you really facilitate a great conversation. But here are 3 things we might think about next.
Perfect. And what about, I don't know, critical thinking, creativity? Are there models out there to evaluate those?
Yeah, so I think I saw on your thing that World Economic Forum. There are a variety of frameworks that exist. As a matter of fact, anyone here, I have my email. If you are interested in some of those models, I'd be happy to send you some of that information. What I would say is that I think you can't, in education, take someone else's model and just implement it and think you're going to get something that's really relevant to yourself, your community, or to your kids. So what I would say is, if we take a first step to step back as educators and ask, what am I really about? What am I about in my classroom? What am I about in my school? And engage in that conversation, and then use some of those models to inform what I'm doing. So you probably know CASEL, CASEL. They have a framework for social emotional literacy in terms of understanding how well I read, because I still have to be able to read. I have to be able to read Google, right? Or whatever I'm reading, Wikipedia. There are things like the Lexile framework, which help me measure specifically some of those skills, or the Quantile framework. Those exist, but you can't just apply it like a hammer or like a pill. I need to self-reflect on what is the meaning it's making for me.
So how can we motivate schools to bring in all those tools and ways of thinking?
I think schools are motivated. I think teachers are motivated already internally because they really care about their kids. I think the person who's in charge of the building in the US, we would call them the principal or a headmaster, literally empowering them to let that magic come forth in the classroom. The classroom is the unit of change. It is the place. It is the locus of instruction, empowering the educator, the instructor, to really move forward there, I think is critical. That's it. I think at a systemic level, business, the economy, they are pushing, right? And I think if you're in this audience and you have influence there at that level, it's really about how can I prepare people to do this work? And if you're following anything about the economy right now, post-pandemic, yep, danger, Will Robinson, we don't have workers, right? I mean, there is a vast labor shortage right now as the economies go through this transformation. So we have an urgent need to make sure that the children, the students, especially in secondary that we're developing, are really ready to go out and to do that. One last thing, Sven, we cannot think about education at the primary and secondary level and not think about higher education. And interestingly enough, I think higher education, it could be a Cambridge or an Oxford here in the US, it could be a Harvard, or it could be the community colleges. The more static higher education is, the harder it is for K-12 to change. And I'm involved in facilitating some conversations there. We have to get higher ed to change in the US. The entire higher education system in California is no longer accepting assessments like the SAT or the ACT, which, by the way, have racist beginnings in the US, so that's a problem. But they realize that we have to get out of this really silly box.
Rigid, yeah.
Yeah.
Now that's great. I mean, that could be a start, right? If higher education gets rid of those type of assessments to filter people in or out the system, then maybe schools can start changing on their own.
It's hard to say you should rethink GPA if GPA is the way that gets you into university.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's just another consequence of that, and a whole new conversation. Kevin, time is up. We have one question. Somebody is asking if you could repeat the name of the research from Dr. Zach.
Yeah, so actually, if you can just Google Paul Zach, okay? You can also look up immersion neuroscience, and you'll find the research. This is technology that was originally developed by the Department of Defense in the US to measure immersion in the classroom. And you can also email me, kevin@edcenter.org, and I'll send it over to you.